We're very pleased and excited to have our first show and share, Seisel's first show and share for the spring semester. We have three great talks today, and I'm here to introduce our first speaker, who was actually just recently profiled on the Seisel website. If you haven't been to the Stahl website, I would highly recommend doing so. It has lots of information about Stahl, how to be, I'm sure you're all affiliates, but how to be affiliates. And this year we started a spotlighting where we spotlight and showcase some of our scholars. And our first spotlight was on Dr. Britt and Durek, who's doing some really interesting work. And our second spotlight, who is currently up, is on the scholar who I'm about to introduce. Norm, Dr. Norm Stahl. He was a founding member of Seisel, and he recently retired after a long and very productive career here at NIU. He is currently a professor emeritus of literacy education here. He's published widely 125 publications across the years, and as you will see, he's still at it. I think of him as a true professor's professor. He has served on numerous editorial boards and held important positions in several professional organizations. Among his numerous accolades, he was selected to be a fellow of the Council of Learning Assistants and Developmental Education Associations, which is the highest honor in that field. And he was also inducted into the Reading Hall of Fame in July of 2017. I could go on and on. So please join me in welcoming him home, Dr. Norm Stahl.
This is the first presentation our team, in a sense, is making on this research since the technical report was released about 2-3 weeks ago. And all. What we're doing, and make sure, I'm a Mac person, so I will screw up a clone machine. This is the team, and you'll see at least one name a lot of you know, Sonia Armstrong, who was with us at NIU for a number of years and has gone on to Texas State University at this stage. Jim King is at University of South Florida, full professor in the literacy department. And then a number of our contacts we worked with at several community colleges. Now the key here is that what we're doing is primarily working with community colleges in this line of work that we're doing. So the research questions, and I'm trying to do this all in the 20 minutes, we're quite interested in what makes up college level being reading ready, okay? And we're looking at traditional developmental reading programs. Developmental reading there's a whole slew of different models that it goes under that umbrella. But the traditional type of program that has been used and is somewhat being phased out at this stage of the game has been pre-college credit courses that students would enroll in. Some schools it would be one course, some it would be a whole string of courses, which caused a pipeline effect. That's another thing to talk about. And then the relationship to career technical programs at community colleges. We have already done a large study, it's been published a number of places, dealing with general education courses. So now we're really in the CTE world, which has become very important again. Okay, Perkins has just been, is being sent through, which is most of the funding, and the other is alignment. And when I'm talking about alignment, when you have courses that are supposed to ready students for a college, whatever is here to help get them ready better have an alignment right like this. Okay, and we've always been worried that it's more like this. And we'll show you how that actually works out in this particular case. So, those are our questions. The study sites. Well, we used 3 community colleges. These 3 community colleges, you will see one was rural, one was suburban, and one was urban. You could have figured out what colleges they were by looking at the people who were the players on this particular technical report, but I'm not going back there. The populations and missions are somewhat different, but nevertheless they all had CTE programming. We let those schools define CTE programming for us, and that I think is a problem. And as we go on to round 3, we are going to focus specifically on things like all the schools, their welding program, all the schools, their nursing program, okay? Because there were some issues right there. The participants, well, faculty and students. The faculty were both full-time and part-time, which is what you do find in CTE programs. The criminology person that I studied at one of the particular schools and worked with, he was a full-time cop. And that becomes important in a couple of moments when we talk about some of the stuff. The students, well, there were a range, but most were first-year students, okay? Now, they may not have come straight from high school to the community colleges because many students don't do that, but they were arranged there. So that's kind of the groups we were working with. Then, how we did this, it was, in a sense, a mixed, I gotta be careful because I always want to call mixed methods, mixed message, which sometimes is exactly what you get. Our data sources, you can see, a survey, observations. We spent a lot of time sitting in classrooms. Sometimes that was glorious, and sometimes, oh my God. Focus groups with both faculty and students, and course artifacts, outlines, texts, these types of things. Data analysis, well, you can see that we analyzed each, worked on it in a number of different ways, and eventually that provided us a certain degree of triangulation. Okay? You can see I'm speeding here. The analysis for the textbooks tells you there the number of books we had that we got from the different types of classes. Since in a number of cases they used the same book, even across institutions, so you won't see the same as the number of classes we looked at necessarily. The analysis that we did was, first we kind of put them into categories. We used Lexiles for our readability measure. We've tried using Spider. We've tried using Conmatrix and some of the other ones that exist. They just don't work. So we fell back with Lexiles in part because that seems to be the most common thing at this moment. The old readability formulas, there is a very close relationship with Lexiles. But this gave us something that we could use for comparisons later on. Okay? So, then, findings. We did have some findings. And again, I mentioned the term earlier, alignment. It is all about alignment in these type of cases. And that's what's important, we believe. So, first, differences in class formats. There is a difference. You will see here from what we're saying is that the developmental reading courses tended to be aligned with what type of teaching you would see in general education. Not aligned with CTE courses whatsoever. I'm overstating a little bit right there. But they were different worlds. And this is problematic for CTE. It's not such a difference when you're talking about general education and developmental reading or developmental writing, comp as well, I would suggest. But we found that there's a difference in class formats, so there's that problem right there. There's also maybe, and we proposed this, I'm not 100% sure, most of the instructors in these courses have ties to gen ed majors. Even if they were in teaching, They still went through those gen ed, either a gen ed major to get to teaching, or they had that broad-based gen ed training that is often required for elementary teachers. Second thing, difference in text types. DR courses, you will see here workbooks you're not surprised about, novels probably not, narrative, and some instructor design type of things where they put together chapters from gen ed books, simulating what students might run into. The difference, though, is that when you get to CTE, and this ties with workplace literacy, the reading is very, very different. One of the surprising things we found here is that in welding, the students got a textbook the first semester. They were in there. And every course they took, going on down the line, they used the same textbook. So they had multiple passes at this material, and they became very good at it, even if they were not the greatest readers. The other thing we found with the type of manuals and everything in the shops was that the students would go in and work with them, and they'd use them multiple terms, but if they didn't understand something, can you come over and explain this to me? It wasn't the shop instructor who was explaining, it was a student from one class above. Okay, because they were often all in the shop at the same dang time. Very different worlds. Yeah.
Sorry, just to clarify before I get more lost, these students are enrolled in both of these classes?
No, some of them might have been.
Okay.
But the vast majority of the individuals in the CTE classes were not necessarily in developmental at that time.
Okay.
Okay?
But may have come through.
They may have come through.
Got it.
And the irony is that there are some places where CTE students, regardless of what a reading score might be or abilities, are not required to take developmental. I don't quite understand that, but I do know that's the case. Course content. Well, again, what you see here for developmental reading is that this is really to get them ready to move on to a traditional U.S. history class, a chemistry class, or whatever else have you. With CTE, very different ballgame, even though there was some talk, the instructor will say, yeah, I kind of help them get ready for reading. Take it with a grain of salt. The majority of the instructors covered the content. Now, here's the interesting thing. There is a great deal in their belief of illiteracy. Illiteracy being that term is you can read, but you don't. And they're, as a whole, fairly upset as the students come through. They don't believe that the students are going to read the materials. So what they do is work with what they call workarounds. And I'll explain that a little more coming down the pike. It's a term developed by Catherine Snow and Mark Conley from the same type of work that was done with 7 community colleges on the East Coast. And we had Catherine Snow here to talk to CISL at the time their study was popping a number of years ago. But this workaround is an important type of thing to think about, as I explain it in a moment, okay? Text differences. We talked a little bit about this already. What you see are very different types of texts, and the way the students look at the texts are somewhat different. There's a lot of information right here, obviously, on this particular side. There are genre differences. They were different from the standpoint of sophistication. We found the DR texts would go up to here. The CTE courses were here. And so these didn't necessarily get up, at least from a Lexile perspective, as high as what the students would be expecting. There was a little overlap, depending upon the field you happen to be in. But as a whole, there's somewhat of a problem right there. And we certainly found that to be the case more recently in looking at a whole set of materials for integrated reading and writing and the textbooks that were out there and what was being required in college classes. There were traditional texts, but the interesting thing is we started to come to the conclusion that there are things in CTE classes that students are essentially reading that are not text. They learn to read a camshaft. That's one example. The drip bag and the mannequin in the nursing classes. The help feature in software programs. And I can go on with a number of these different things, but they're actually doing something like reading them and processing them in somewhat the same way. And we need to figure out a lot more about that. And we've been digging with that. We haven't got answers yet there. And they were used in different ways. And I mentioned kind of that already. The text is just simply used differently. Faculty expectations. Boy, everybody seemed to end up and start to say students should be able to handle all the materials when they walk in the classroom. Should be independent, no problems whatsoever. But they simply said the students weren't ready to do that. This is where they were getting into the I'm going to say illiteracy, not illiteracy, illiteracy type of thing. The students, though, said, yes, we understand it's more difficult. There's going to be more. And they would say, well, 75% of them said they do 75% or more of the reading assigned in a class. So this is interesting that they believe two very different things, the students and the faculty, but then the faculty have two counter beliefs going on in their mind. They should be able to do this, but no, they don't. Well, there's a problem there. We've got to figure out how to handle that. Here's the assumptions with the students, and you can see one of the things that the students were pretty clear about all the way through is that books were too damn expensive and they weren't being asked to read them. And that's getting to these workaround things. What's a workaround? If you give the student the entire amount of information they need on a PowerPoint, if you give them all the information they need because you give them the class notes and everything is based on the class notes, see where I'm going with there are different ways, videos, whatever else. The students think, I don't have to read. They don't. But they do have to buy the damn book because of accreditation. And then they get very angry. And then they sell them back for a loss. So a lot of students now are trying to find ways around the books, particularly with traditional publications and things like that are very expensive. The open source stuff obviously is a new revolution. So here we go, workarounds. Faculty truly believe the content is important. I mean, that's true in secondary schools, that's true in college. Content is king. So they do these alternative types of things. This was interesting, and this is different than with what we found with the GE courses and instructors. They didn't really care how the student got the skill, the information, the competency, whatever else, the knowledge, as long as they got it. And that fits kind of the mindset, if you think about the work world in many respects. And again, we get back to this thing right there about students negative. And they blame the high schools. Of course, the high schools blame the middle schools, you know, all the way down to the parents. But this is an important thing at this particular stage, particularly in this world where everything is about being college ready. Okay. Then we start getting to some of these ideas about what is disciplinary or professional literacy. Disciplinary literacy is a 10-year idea at this particular time under that particular label. Okay. It goes back far, far back there. Academic literacy, but we've traced it back at least to the 1920s as the beginning of that construct. But what we start to find is that disciplinary literacy and CTE literacy, professional literacy, are really two different things. And if courses are preparing students for the disciplinary literacy, and that's just not DR, but English 1A, English 101, is focusing on this area. You don't see a lot of English 1As that are tied to welding. There's a different type of thing going on. And so we're starting to have some belief here that we need to be looking at how the faculty get students to learn to read like an expert in auto. Okay, this type of thing. What we found was that, yes, like with the crim instructor, he ended up saying, and I thought this was great, about how students, you need to be able to do good writing. Because there was one time I filled out a criminal report on a student, I'm sorry. We would like to maybe, on a perp. And I made the mistake of saying he had a red shirt on when he had a brown shirt on. And he walked because of that. Now, we found in these type of classes that much of the information came across as war stories. And the students really liked that. That's when they all of a sudden paid real attention. Now, often that did bring forward the idea the person was trying to share, but it's a different way of approaching that you find necessarily in a lot of the gen eds and how it's going on. There's far more contextualization going on. So conceptualizations of literacy and faculty, and this is where we're kind of getting at it here. While they still do some traditional literacy types of practices, it's a bit different. Here is where, again, pointing out this problem of it's fairly generic in what they're doing, and it's going to run down a particular role. And they'll tell you that they do disciplinary literacy. They really don't. I mean, they know the fad. They're thinking disciplinary literacy in many respects in DR type courses is what content field literacy used to be, which is a different thing altogether. Hope that makes some sense. Then the students, how did they see the act of reading? Well, are you surprised? I can read, I just don't read too fast. I can't tell you how many times over the years I used to hear that. What they start to believe, there are some things that may help them along the way. And here we have more about text usage and things of that particular nature. This still continues to be somewhat different than what we're seeing from the instructors. And we're still trying to unpack that a little bit. Status. We're starting to look at positionality theory. McVie does it in literacy. And it's trying to figure out where different types of programs fit within a larger culture. And that's a very simplistic way of talking about it, but it's about as far as I can go. But we know that DR faculty clearly believe they're second-class citizens on campus, maybe third class. What we don't have here is that the CTE instructors believe the same thing. I think if you think about this particular campus, NIU, that type of thing exists as well, particularly around the professional class schools as opposed to LANS. It's not an unusual type of thing in institutions. So we found that to be a case. What we did find, though, is that the CTE faculty knew about DE courses, but they really didn't know what was going on in them. And that starts to suggest that they aren't talking with one another, and the silo effect exists. And what is necessary is to have them get together and talk about some of these things we were mentioning earlier where there is not an alignment. It also starts to say that you're probably going to have to do some specialized types of work with students who are going down the CTE route as opposed to those who might be going into the gen ed and transferring later on. Okay. And then here we have goals. The expectation is that they should leave the courses and be able to successfully read highly technical material. That's what is wanted. Well, that's a gap, and that becomes problematic, and how are they going to get them to that level? That again calls for something where the DR type instructors, and I would say composition instructors, I would say anybody who's doing these entry level types of things into post-secondary, need to be going and observing and talking and meeting. And that means the institution needs to be supporting that type of thing going on. That may mean in many cases, because so many of the individuals are part-timers, they're going to get a little extra pay to do that type of thing. And that's just me on a soapbox for a moment. Okay, recommendations. Recommendations is not something we're going to get through because there's a number of them. But the point I think you can see from what we're doing here is that this is a very different world in CTE than it is in Gen Ed. And we give a positionality to general education that is far stronger, I can't get the right word there, than it would be for the CTE. You know, if you think in the high school, send the people in the shop classes down to the basement, except for the two home economic courses which were up on the 4th floor. This still is one of the schools in CT. We're over in this building. We never see or have anybody come to talk to us. Now, truth is, I could see some advantages to that, but the truth of the matter is they are siloed off in a way. And as CTE becomes more important, and the most important policy that's coming forth in the state right now is all in that way, in that direction. If you take a look at it, it's real interesting there. All students have to have something that starts to say they're ready for careers. I think we need to be looking at this more. Overall, I think this is an area that is very fruitful for future research and more research. And we're just starting our track, going down this track with CTE. As I said, we are going to be looking at, put IRB papers in for doing work in Texas, going in this week. And we will be hopefully in the Houston area, and we'll probably be looking at a lot of what is done in the area of oil exploration and what the community colleges are doing. So, are there questions of any sort? Britt.
Okay, this is sort of an unanswerable question in a way, or a crazy question, but how much of the CTE professions, once they get out in the world and they're doing their job, like a cop or whatever, because you can't really answer this question because there's all these professions, but involve reading or literacy?
Well, they all involve literacy of some sort.
Right.
If you are using the type of definition that naturally you would use in psychology from the standpoint of your students coming in and going out, it's different.
Yeah.
Everyone has a different type of literacy. If we are talking about do those individuals have other lifespan uses of literacy, then they might start to coalesce with across different types of fields in every field. But every field has a different type of literacy.
Do they leverage, sorry, I'm going to go to goal state, but do they leverage the goal state, like, of how you're going to use this in your profession of reading in the...
Well, that's one of the things that we believe kind of is happening.
Like the guy
We
doing
do
writing.
know that the community colleges are doing a very good job around the country of going forward to the people in these different fields and saying, what do you need, what do you want? And they're doing a better job in the four-year institutions. Okay. And in part, that's because they're funding. I mean, Kishwaukee doesn't get funding if they're not going out talking to, I can't even think of what, any field, nursing or whatever else. They do a better job, I think, than the four-year institution. That's an opinion, but I think they do. Please.
An interesting question is whether, with that information,
whether they communicate it directly to students so
Right.
that students understand how their classroom learning will translate.
The students are interested in that. I don't think they do a good enough job.
I don't know if we do.
I don't think I do.
No.
I mean, we meaning me.
Yeah. me.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you from the standpoint of NIU, we at one point for, it would have been elementary and actually for reading and whatever programs we had, found that we got in some trouble with accreditation because we did not do that to the degree we were supposed to with students. And we turned around and plugged it in. Now, whether it's, I don't know if it's going on, but it was an important type of thing. I think we all could do a much, much better job. That also means, to a certain degree, we need to have better partnerships with what's going on in the field and not necessarily be just tied to our campus and our lab, you know, and whatever else. We need more contemporary experience of what's going on out in the real world. The report is now up on 2 different places. The summary report, which I'm willing to send you if you just ask for, is down to about 10 pages. I mean, that's readable. Okay? So, thank you.